I should point out that although I'm listed as a co-author, I haven't actually done any of this work. I've just inherited this program from my wonderful predecessor and her colleagues that have done all of this. So I'm really fortunate to have all this excellent work done. I'm going to try and summarize some of the highlights, I think, from the last 5 years of work. So I think my talk has been really nicely set up by the last two speakers. We know that physical disturbance is the most critical stressor for forest land birds. And trying to understand exactly what those effects are is complicated because it's a really complicated landscape out there. The boreal forest is naturally quite variable in terms of habitat, and there's a lot going on in terms of human disturbances out there. So we have a variety of energy sector disturbances, cut lines, well pads, roads, pipelines, and there's forestry impacts overlaid throughout a lot of the oil sands areas as well. But we really know, there's not any doubt at this point, I would say, that land birds are being impacted by all this development on the landscape. So these figures come from a paper that was done in the Athabasca oil sands region. So we know that disturbance has affected the densities of about 3/4 of the species out there, some negatively, some positively. 43% of those species showed a really substantial change in density. And overall, we've seen about a 15% change in bird community composition for an 8.4% disturbance of the landscape. So about twice as much change in the bird community as there is physical disturbance. And we know that energy and forestry sector stressors are the most important impacts out there in this landscape. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights from several studies that EC has led. And I've sort of grouped these into a few different areas, but some of the reasons for doing these types of studies, one was we were trying to identify priorities. So as Aaron mentioned, there's a lot of species out there. This is a complex landscape. We needed to be able to set priorities. Where should we focus initially to try and get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of understanding what's going on? And one of those things was trying to figure out which of these species are specialists and which of them are generalists. And that's really important because in general, we think that specialists would be more sensitive to disturbances than generalists will be. And then we've also done some work on really trying to quantify some of these cumulative impacts and try and separate the impacts of individual stressors compared to the total impact. And in particular, we're really focused on trying to understand if these effects are additive or interactive. So does the effect of stressor A and stressor B, is it the same as, can you just add up the effect of those individual stressors, or is it more complicated than that? And I'll briefly touch on a sort of a focused priority study that we've done as well. So just before we move on, I just want to give you a sense of the breadth in terms of where we've been working. So this is an example of study areas, study locations from just one of the studies that I'll be talking about today. In total, we've done bird surveys in about 7,000 different points across all the oil sands areas. Not all studies have occurred across this entire scale, but a number of them have. So the work I'm talking about, it's fairly generalizable. So we'll start with this study where we were trying to look at identifying groups of species that were associated with specific habitats and trying to figure out, trying to identify specialists that might be particularly sensitive to development. We used briefly ordination to try and associate the species with habitat variables, and you come up with a plot like this. And you don't need to look at, those are all different species codes. That doesn't really matter as far as you're concerned. What I want you to take away is that there are groups of species associated with each of these different types of habitats on the landscape, and some of them are quite distinct. Some habitats, like the upland coniferous forests, have a unique bird community with species that specialize in that habitat and don't really occur in high density in other habitats. In general, for this graph, specialists are around the outside edges of the plot, and species that are found more close to the center are generalists. So, there we go. So we have species like an ovenbird, which is actually classified as a specialist in deciduous habitats. There's a large group of species that cluster up here that specialize in open habitats. Black-backed woodpecker specializes in burned habitats. And there's this large group down in this corner that specialize in these upland coniferous and particularly old upland coniferous forests. So they're a really unique group of species. And something else that popped out of this work, if we looked at, there's 5 listed species, so listed provincially or federally, that occurred in commonly enough in this study for us to include. All 5 of those are classified as specialists. So this immediately, to me, raises a little red flag. Why are none of them generalists? It really sort of supports that idea that specialists are indeed potentially more sensitive. And there's a lot of other evidence to sort of suggest that specialists might actually be in trouble here. So many of them use old forests. And old forests are a habitat that is rare on the landscape. And it's one that can't regenerate quickly once it's been removed. 40% of specialists have declining populations, and 60% have declining species intactness indices. These are both at a much higher rate than you find in generalist species. And again, we have this fact that many listed species are specialists, sort of suggesting that they might already have declined or been impacted to the point that we've needed to list them. Generalists tend to have increasing populations, and I'm a community ecologist, is what I consider myself, and I think this is really important because generalists, like bird communities, species do not exist in isolation. If a generalist is increasing, that's potentially going to impact specialists or other species through processes like competition and predation, either of adults or chicks or eggs. So it's really important, in my mind, to understand what's happening with the community as a whole. Some other ways we've used this type of analysis is to try and figure out how to set priorities for focal studies, sort of more focused work. And so I'm briefly going to touch on one study that we've done. And this was really, there was a lot of thought went into how to pick this study. So Lisa chose to go and work in lowland forests. And there's a really good reason for that, because lowland forests make up about 40% of the oil sands area. But from the bird perspective, there'd been very little work done in there. So we didn't know that much about what's going on. She worked with SAGD disturbances, because these are rapidly becoming the most predominant physical disturbance on the landscape. And she very carefully went out and picked a specialist species and a generalist species to try and contrast a species that might be more sensitive compared to one that may be less sensitive. So the species she picked are dark-eyed junco and palm warbler. So they are both very typical species of these lowland forests, but dark-eyed junco is a generalist and palm warbler is a specialist species. So what we found really sort of supports this hypothesis. So this is work still in progress. We have a master's student that's supposed to be writing her thesis right at this very moment. So the generalist, the dark-eyed junco, not sure how well it's showing up on the map. Oops. But right across here, there's a vegetated wide linear feature, probably a pipeline or winter road, and there's a well pad, vegetated well pad here. The dark-eyed juncos clearly are including these disturbances in their territories, so that the shaded areas are territories for individual birds. But what some of you closer to the front can see, but you may not be able to see at the back, there's a bunch of dark specks as well. Those are observations for actual specific locations for where these birds were foraging, and dark-eyed juncos will forage in these disturbances. So they are using them. We haven't yet got to the point where we can tell if they are using them greater than they are available in their territory. So we don't know if they prefer these habitats in any way, but they are using them. So it suggests that they're, not necessarily that bad for the species. When you look at the palm warbler, you see fairly substantial differences. So they do seem to include some of these disturbances in their estimated territory, whether they're actually using them or if they're just passing over them, or if this is, at this point, just sort of an artifact of the territory estimation technique, I'm not entirely sure. But there's very little evidence that they actually forage in these disturbances. So while they may include them in their territory, potentially, it also looks like they may not physically be using them in any sort of meaningful sense. What I forgot to mention with the last slide is for both of these species, their territory size appears to be larger when they include disturbances in their territory. And this is really important because we think that in a lot of breeding systems, there's no reason why a bird would have a territory that's larger than it needs because they have to defend it from other birds. So if you have a larger territory, it implies that you have lower habitat quality. So even in the generalist species that is using these habitat features, there's a possibility that the quality may still be reduced. So there may be more subtle effects happening. In general, we see, This is a graph showing the green is the estimated density that you would see in a landscape without any disturbance, and the gray is the estimated density that you would see in a landscape with the disturbances that we have currently. What you see for species that prefer open and deciduous habitats is that we tend to see more species in the landscape with disturbances than we would see in the landscape without any, suggesting that they're benefiting from these types of disturbances. Okay? Not true for all species, but for most species it is. And in general, these open and deciduous species tend to be generalists. Okay? Species that prefer coniferous forests, not all, but many of them are specialists. And in general, they tend to have lower densities in the current landscape, the one with disturbances, than we would expect in a landscape without any. So in general, we expect that they're being negatively impacted. That's the message from that. So I think from a variety of studies at a variety of different scales, we see that we have pretty good evidence for declining diversity. Generalists tend to be increasing in density, whereas specialists tend to be decreasing in density. And we're sort of seeing a shift towards communities being made up more of generalists. And this is a process we call biotic homogenization. And so we're sort of moving from a world where the boreal forests used to have a diversity of bird communities towards one where the boreal forest is going to be dominated by birds like black-capped chickadees and crows and robins. And these are all great species. There's nothing wrong with them. But I, for one, would be really sad to see a loss of diversity in species and in communities as well. So now I'm going to switch up gear a little bit and talk about some of the other work we've done trying to look at exactly which of these stressors are important. So this has taken place in the Athabasca oil sands area. We were looking at forestry impacts as well as a variety of energy sector impacts. And so some species, which effects are important depends on the species. So something like an alder flycatcher responds really positively to forest harvest and really responds neutrally. It doesn't really seem to matter about a lot of the energy sector impacts. But then you get species like red-breasted nuthatch, which seems to increase in association with roads and pipelines, but seems to be fairly negatively impacted by seismic lines. Okay, but it's slightly more complicated than this. So, you can get what we call synergistic effects. So if you have a forestry cut, harvest, and pipeline, what is the effect? So can you add up those two single effects together? Or if it's greater than the sum of those two individual effects, then we have something called a synergistic effect. We can also get something called an antagonistic effect, where the effect would be reduced compared to the sum of the two. What we've found is that almost 40% of species show synergistic effects. And this is really critical for us to understand what's going on in the landscape. So I'll just show you one example, common raven. Okay. Common ravens seem to respond quite strongly to well pads, so they increase in density near well pads. And the effects of pipelines, roads, and seismic lines is pretty neutral overall. But this is a synergistic model, and I'm just want you to pay attention to that yellow line. That's the synergistic model. The dashed line in this graph here, that's what we would get if we just assumed that we could add up these effects individually. Okay? It would suggest that the impact would be much less. So we have a synergistic effect happening. Basically, what it means is that the increase of ravens around wells is much greater if there are also pipelines, roads, and wells in the area than it would be otherwise. Okay. Why do we care about ravens? They're already relatively common. They're one of those generalist species. Well, they're also nest predators. And so if you have an increase in ravens around a well pad, then you're quite likely going to have cascading effects on the productivity of other birds that are living in that same area. So this is again where the whole community perspective I think is really important. Can't think about any of these species individually. They all interact. So just to sort of try and wrap things up, in conclusion, most species out there are affected by disturbances. Not that many species overall are specialists, but they do seem to be a lot more sensitive than the generalists are. Which stressors are important really varies among the species, but you can't always just think about them individually because the effects of disturbances are synergistic for 2/5 of the species out there, fairly high percentage. I will repeat the caveat that Aaron had, which is that most of these species are migratory, and so they can be impacted at other points during their life cycle. Nevertheless, I think there's really clear evidence that there are significant impacts happening on the breeding grounds. They're not all negative. Some species are responding positively, but that too has big implications for what's happening with the bird community as a whole. And I guess I would also like to reiterate that I think both Aaron's talk and mine have sort of shown the real value in using a variety of studies and looking at a variety of spatial scales, looking at behavior all the way up through population level work, because they all tell you slightly different pieces of the puzzle, and quite often that's what we need to understand what's really going on. So with that, these are a lot of our collaborators, and if you have any more questions, you can ask me, but you can also direct yourself to these papers. So thank you.